And my own research has been focused in the last 10 years on looking at actually ancient public space in East Africa, which is where I work. I'm going to talk a little bit about that place today, but what I really want to do today is talk about the very deep notions that I think we can see in the archaeology of public space, and to maybe think about the way in which the divide between what I do and what you all do is not so large. And I think there's lots that can be learned, in fact, by looking at cities and societies long past, where we have thousands of years, literally thousands of years, to look at the way people have experimented with public space, the way they've constructed it, altered it, used it, abused it, destroyed it. And I think these are all some important things to be thinking about as we go forward. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of different places. So part of this, I'm just going to do a very sort of brief survey. I'm going to show you lots of pretty pictures of interesting places that you may or may not have heard about. And then I'm going to talk at the end about a little bit of depth, two areas in Mesoamerica and my own area in East Africa. So I'm going to begin here, this is the Greek Agora. Because I wanted to begin here because I think there's a sort of a common thought that this is somehow the wellspring of the advent of public space. And the assumption here is that there's a classical Western tradition based on Greek city-states that was a model, really, for later experimentation and instantiation of public space. And although there's surely a discrete tradition of public space that, in fact, draws its connection to the Athenian Agora, I'm here to tell you today that a couple of things. One is that there's really a much deeper past to the notion of public and common space, and it's linked to very old forms, I believe, of human social gathering. So part of what I'm going to do today is sort of show you some of these very old forms of human social gathering. That there is actually a very diverse worldwide phenomenon of public and common space whose richness is pretty clearly indicates that there is really no single origin. And finally, that we really see public space. I think there's a lot to be learned. Obviously, we're focused on cities is where sort of there's a crisis, I think, of public space. But when we look backwards, there's times before cities or places that don't really fit into the city category, I think can be very interestingly thought about as interesting examples of public space. So it's present in a range of human settlements. Okay, so we're going to begin. The first place I'm going to show you is a place called Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is in Turkey. And this is just an amazingly fascinating site. This is what the site looks like as being excavated. I'm going to show you reconstruction now. And what's so interesting about this site is that it includes a series of massive stone T-pillars, each up to a height of about 6 meters, and they weigh each up to a weight about 20 tons. Now, we think, okay, that's impressive. It's not that impressive. But what's impressive is that this site is at least 12,000 years old. Now, 12,000 years old is before there were cities. It's before there were domesticated crops. It's before people lived in permanent settlements. So this is a settlement where hunter-gatherers, these are people who were mobile on the landscape, who hunted wild animals and gathered crops, came together, probably from an area of 100 miles away or more, and slowly built this amazing public gathering space. And archaeologists believe that it was they came here really as a sacred pilgrimage site, a place to come together, a place to cook communal meals, and a place to honor ancestors and people who have departed. Now, the reason I'm starting with this is because it's kind of a recent find, and it really changes the way we think about the possibilities of building communal spaces long before there were cities. So the next place I want to show you, which you all are familiar with, is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is not as old. It's about 5,000 years old, still pretty old. And the people that built Stonehenge did similar things. They moved massive stone blocks. They set them up into this communal space. But they were farmers. They had domesticated crops. They had domesticated animals. But like Göbekli, I'm pairing it with Göbekli because it really represents, I think, a place where people were building, I think, some of the earliest forms of public space. This is an urban space, but public spaces where people would come together again, honor the ancestors, come together for the equinoxes, for the solstices, have meals together. The next place I want to show you, we're going to go back in time a little bit, is also in Turkey, and this is a place called Çatalhöyük, which is also kind of an amazing place. It's a 9,000-year-old town, and it is believed, I think it's pretty solid to say, it's one of the earliest permanent settlements that we know about archaeologically. And this was a very dense settlement of people, and these people lived at Çatalhöyük. Were also, so this is between, let's say, between Göbekli and Stonehenge. These people were experimenting with crops, but they were largely hunting their food, gathering food, and experimenting with crops and animals, but they had decided to live together in this very dense settlement. So when you look at it, you can see these houses sort of just chock-a-block next to each other. You're probably wondering, well, I don't see any public spaces. Well, what's so fascinating about Çatalhöyük is that the access to the houses was all through the roofs. And so the roof portion of this site was a massive public space. And so we can see now sort of the creativity, the complications in the way ancient settlements offer us examinations of public space. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to move on, and I'm going to start talking. I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, about a number of different. I'm just going to sort of flip through a number of different places to just show you the public spaces that existed there. This is a site called Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. This is a very old site, 4,600 years ago, same time as the pyramids of Egypt. This is a site with lots of urban planning actually involved. We can see some very well planned streets. Some of the larger squares you're seeing there are public baths. So these are places, different forms of public space, but public space that was also quite well planned. We're going to shift all the way across the world to the coast of Peru. This is a site called Caral. This is one of the earliest pyramid sites in all of North and South America. And you can see very clearly here, this is 4,600 years ago. So this is also the same time as the Egyptian pyramids, a densely populated settlement, and then a massive, massive amphitheater for public events and public spaces. But again, very different shape, very different relationship to the site itself. We'll move north of it to Mesoamerican sites. This is Monte Albán in Mexico, a 2,500-year-old pyramid and public plaza complex with a city associated with it. And this is Teotihuacan in Mexico as well. These Mesoamerican cities, I'm going to talk more about these later, are really fantastic places that were very much centered on the notion of building out from public spaces rather than building public spaces into the cities. We're going to move north. This is in the United States. This is in the southwest United States, in Chaco Canyon, a place called Pueblo Bonito. It's only 1,000 years old. Only 1,000 years old. And in these very compact settlements, we can see built in all of this public space. This is places where dances and other initiation rituals would have occurred. But all of these circles are structures called kiva. These are subterranean communal structures where more private rituals would have happened, and they're associated with different parts of the settlement. This is a site called Cahokia. Now I'm sort of tracking to the east now. This is in Illinois. It's a site about 1,000 years old, and another, you can see the sort of southern North American tradition of pyramids. A lot of archaeologists call this one of the first cities in the United States. Very large earthen mound and a very large intentional grand plaza, which in fact took thousands. We always focus on the mounds. This was incredible mounds, lots of labor that went into constructing these mounds, but in fact the construction of the plazas themselves were just as labor intensive. The leveling, the scraping, the moving of earth. This is now moved to Africa. This is the continent that I work on. This is a site called Gene Gene, or at least a reconstruction of it. It's a fascinating site. It's about 1,500 years old. Very densely populated settlement in the inland Niger Delta, where there are contemporary settlements today. What's so fascinating about Gene Gene, this is a city, very much a city, with no sense of any class distinctions, no hierarchies, no larger structures for elites or people that rule the country, the city. But the city itself contained a very large and active market for the very diverse populations that the inland Niger Delta supports: fishermen, farmers, pastoralists. And so we can see here the sort of very active interpretation of very active public spaces, but people are all living in relatively similar types of structures. And then this is my part of the world, the Swahili coast, the East African Swahili coast. This is a site in Kenya called Gede. These are settlements that were built by African populations as they interacted with Muslim merchants across the Indian Ocean. And they have these very compact, multiple house structures, also very much involved building walls and enclosing this incredible area of public space, which in fact, before I started doing work, we really didn't understand what these spaces were for. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So what we can see, I think, in all of these examples is that in many different times, in many different places, there are this incredible variety of the way that humans have constructed and used public space within densely populated settlements. The depth of time, I mean, I started with Göbekli and Çatalhöyük and Stonehenge to sort of show you that the great depth, I think, of the notion of constructing public space, pre-urban, pre-settlement, pre-dense dense populations. And so one of the things I want to make sure you understand from all this is that my argument is, in fact, that the urge or the need to build public space is not really one that emerges out of urbanism, I would say. I think it has become, it becomes more of a challenge within urban forms as the populations grow and as space becomes limited. But it is, in fact, I think, a human quality that we can see in all of these examples. So the last thing that I want to do is I want to talk a little bit in depth about two different cases. The first is in Mesoamerica. I'm going to go back to these slides of Monte Alban and Teotihuacan, and then I'm going to talk about the Swahili. So for the Mesoamerican examples, these are really fantastic. If anybody's visited these places, they're really phenomenal places. They are built, these public spaces are built basically in relief around these very large pyramid structures. They frame these public spaces. And the monuments that surround these large plazas often contain inscriptions and monuments that reflected the power and authority of the rulers who constructed these. In them, you can see ancestral genealogies, you can see representations of the achievements in political and military affairs, and some suggestion, in fact, that these rulers could communicate and mediate with supernatural forces. So when we look at these plaza, sort of pyramid plaza type examples, I think we tend to think, we might think that public spaces in Mesoamerican towns were simply there to kind of establish and maintain authority and power. This is sort of traditionally how they're seen. The plazas are representations of power to convince the masses. And that somehow the people that live in these spaces are just there as participants to this power. But I think what the research archaeologists have done is shown that conception is often wrong. And there are numerous ways, I think, in fact, that we can see the way that bottom-up practices can, in fact, or in fact just as important, if not sort of structurally, or important in the construction and maintenance of these plazas. So I want to talk a little bit about some what I would call participatory practices of people in these places. First, the construction of the plazas themselves, we have a sense that it was, in fact, the construction of the plaza itself was itself an act of community building. Okay, and I talked a little bit about this, that in many of these, not in this one, this is a very large one, but in many of these pyramid and plaza examples, the amount of earth that's moved to build the plaza is actually more than the material that's moved to build the pyramids. Okay? So we tend to think of the plazas as just the area that the pyramids surrounded, but in fact the construction of the plaza itself was just as important or as large an act as building the pyramids. The other thing that's so fascinating is that there's lots of documentation that sort of we can read into the Mesoamerican past, and we know that the way people thought about plazas was actually a scaling up of the way they thought about patios. We talk about patios in Mesoamerica. These are spaces that are related to houses. And the way people talked about, if you ask people about a household, they wouldn't say these are the people of a similar house. They would say these are people of a single patio. What linked people was not the house. What linked people was the space, the outdoor public space. And so in many ways, we can think about these plazas as kind of a scaling up of this patio. And in fact, that's how probably most people that lived in these towns actually thought about this. The town, as it grew, became a scaling up. The town was a model, a metaphor for these patio groups. And of course, the other thing that that makes this a social participatory place is that these plazas were places where there were rituals, where games were played, where feasts were held. These were very much sort of places of spectacle and everyday events as well. Now, one note of caution, so I'm sort of painting this lovely kind of picture about, oh, it's all beautiful and wonderful in these places. But there are many examples, in fact, in this site, especially in Monte Alban, where things changed dramatically. So the main plaza at Monte Alban, which we're looking at, was originally built as one of these places for public ceremonies, very much instantiation of sort of social cohesion. But over time, as archaeologists, we can track the way that elite complexes began to slowly enclose the plaza. And they began to restrict access. And therefore the plaza went from being a very inclusive place, a place of participation, to a place of exclusion that focused exclusively on elite-focused activities. So public space can go bad, right? It can go wrong. And one of the things that archaeology can do is really track that at some of these examples. The last place I want to talk about, which is my own place of research, this is a site called Sonamnara. It's in southern Tanzania. It's a Swahili town. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's a very small town, but it's a town that interested me for a long time because it has lots of architecture, but in fact it included a whole host of open, what we won't call it public because it was just open space. We didn't know what it was. And through the research that I've been doing there over the last 6-7 years, we found out a lot of things about this space. So for one, we found that this space here, in fact, had rows of earthen houses that sort of people of different classes had constructed, and that by building them, they had constructed their own public space right here. This became then a space where they could do craft activities, where they would dry their nets, where they would dry their fish, where they would do all sorts of public activities. But they constructed this space within the confines of a larger plan built by the elite members of society. We also found that this central area, this is probably the most planned area, which contained a mosque and a very dense network, very dense set of graves. And that at these graves is a place of commemoration. It's a public space, a cemetery, but a public space, set right into the center of the settlement, where people would go and make offerings, people would go and make commemorative meals, but it was something that was very public and important to the society itself. And finally, in this space here, we now know that they had groves and trees. This was a green space. And so one of the things that we can see, one of the things that I think is very interesting about Swahili spaces is that they're framed, they're planned in a sense by an elite class of people in society. But the bottom up, but the public spaces themselves are inhabited and transformed and managed in many ways by the full range of people in that settlement. And so I think, so this example, and I think many of the examples that I talked about, sort of teaches us about the way that planning and practice are really two sides of this coin. And we need to be thinking a lot. We think a lot about planning, especially in archaeology, ways in which plans tell us about the way that towns were planned. But archaeology allows us to sort of understand the way places were used and transformed. And I think that dialectic, that struggle between planning and practice, between the powerful and the participatory, is one of the things that can provide a challenge, I think, from the past as we think about public space for the future. Thank you.